We started chapter 20 in the last video, and we talked about how Congress rose to be the dominant force in the United States government. And the reason for that was that there were a series of lackluster presidents, not to mention the power of the Senate and the chaos and disorganization of the House of Representatives. And we ended our discussion by talking about African Americans in the South after Reconstruction and the rise of Booker T. Washington as a, quote, reasonable civil rights leader. So that brings us to our topic today. We're beginning with city bosses. And city bosses came into being because of the stresses of rapid urban growth. Rapid city growth, the strain on the infrastructures, and the increasing influx of immigrants led to a crisis in urban city government. And so that turmoil gave rise to urban political bosses. And most of them were Irish because they came in the first wave of immigration, and they sent immigrants to the polls by the thousands. These bosses gained power by providing social services for the urban poor. So basically the way this worked was they gave social services to the poor in exchange for the political support of the urban poor. So like when new immigrants came in, the bosses would find them jobs, they would distribute food. If a minor crime took place, the boss could often fix it quietly and sort of off the record. The bosses took care of educating the immigrants on American civilization, what it was like to be an American citizen. They distributed food to the homeless, gave shoes to kids at Christmas, and all of that was great, but the price of it was political support from the people they were helping. Money for these services came from bribes, exchanges for favors, kickbacks, and despite their welfare work and their popularity, most of these bosses were essentially thieves. And this system survived because the comfortable urban dwellers didn't really care at all about the fate of the poor. And city governments weren't really doing anything to help their fate either. So many reformers resented the boss system, mainly because it gave political power to people who were not gentlemen. Crops and complaints. Farmers really did not do well beginning around the 1890s. They did well after the Civil War and into the 1880s, but the economic and social status of farmers really declined in the late 1800s, and their discontent forced American politics to confront their problems. They suffered from droughts, poor harvests, there were restrictive tariffs and fiscal policies, low commodity prices, and not to mention cheap goods from abroad. And so this downward swing in the business cycle made their plight even worse, which gave rise to the populist movement. So the agricultural depression triggered an outburst of political radicalism, pretty much. Sometimes it's been called the Alliance Movement. Discontented farmers formed this group called the Farmers Alliance, and they spread throughout the South. They gained support into the Midwest, and these farmers entered politics in the election of 1890. And so in 1892, these farm groups combined with representatives of the Knights of Labor and other professional reformers to organize the Populist Party, sometimes called the People's Party. And they held a national convention. And in this convention, they adopted a sweeping platform that called for a graduated income tax, the nationalization of railways, telegraph, and telephone systems, the sub-treasury plan, and the unlimited coinage of silver. The party also called for the adoption of the initiative and referendum, popular elections of U.S. senators, an 8-hour workday, and even immigration restrictions. And so in this presidential candidate, the populist candidate did not really win. Cleveland defeated Harrison, and the populist candidate, a guy named James B. Weaver, attracted over 1 million votes, but the results in congressional and state races were disappointing for the populists. And opponents of the populists in the South played on racial fears, and the populists really failed to attract any support of the urban workers. They were confined pretty much just to the farming population. So by the 1890s, discussion of the federal monetary policy revolved around the coinage of silver. And in truth, this issue of silver versus gold was really just the surface issue. The important question was, should something be done to check the deflationary spiral? Deflation happens when the inflation rate falls below zero, and so in essence, the prices of goods fall. That works really well for people on a fixed income, but for everyone else, that really doesn't serve them any good. But traditionally, the United States had used gold and silver coins, but it almost became not even worth it to take silver to the mint because a silver dollar could be melted down and it would be worth $1.03. So it was worth more just to not take it to the mint. But the silver mines of Nevada and Colorado began to flood the market with silver and depressing the price of silver. And so it again became profitable to coin silver bullion. The problem was that when the miners were getting ready to coin, they realized that the Coinage Act of 1873 had been passed about 20 years before that, which had demonetized the metal. And demonetization just means that it was no longer a legitimate form of money. And so silver miners were furious, and inflationists and silver miners demanded a return to bimetallism, or the coinage of gold and silver. And conservatives resisted, but ultimately there was a series of compromises. The first one was the Bland-Allison Act, and I will put that up here. The Bland-Allison Act, and this one was passed in 1878, and it authorized the purchase of $2 million to $4 million worth of silver per month at market price. And it really didn't have much inflationary impact because the government consistently bought the minimum. They stuck around that $2 million mark. Also, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. I'm not sure why I'm writing it because all of these words are easy to spell. Oh, maybe not. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act. And this one was passed a couple years later in 1890, and it required the government to buy 4.5 million ounces of silver monthly. However, increasing supplies drove the price of silver still lower. Both the Silverites and the gold bugs, as they were called, warned of the possibility of financial disaster if their policies weren't followed. And the London banking house of Baring Brothers in 1893 collapsed, and this precipitated a financial panic that led to worldwide industrial depression. Mines and factories closed permanently. President Cleveland believed that this controversy over silver caused the depression because it shook the confidence of the business community. So he actually ordered a special session of Congress and forced them to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. And the southern and western wings of the Democratic Party split over this. And so in spring of 1894, there were several armies of unemployed men marching on Washington to demand relief, and the main one was led by a guy named Jacob Coxey, and he wanted the government to undertake a federal works program in order to give people jobs and allow communities to exchange no-interest bonds with the Treasury for $500 million in paper currency. Coxey was arrested for trespassing and his followers were dispersed. And the way that President Cleveland handled Coxey and his army and then the Pullman strike just further eroded public confidence in him. And the people were outraged when it took a syndicate of bankers headed by J.P. Morgan to avert a run on the Treasury, or to avoid, a bunch of people pulling money out at the same time. So with the silver issue looming ever larger and the populace wanting unlimited coinage of silver, the major parties could no longer avoid the money question. So that brings us to the election of 1896. The Republicans endorsed William McKinley, and they endorsed the gold standard, or the idea that only gold should be coined and not silver. And then the Democrats chose William Jennings Bryan as their guy, and they endorsed a platform of free silver. And although, they were concerned over the loss of their party identity, the populace also named Bryan as well. So he was actually the Democratic candidate and the populist candidate, and McKinley was the Republican. The populace did pick a different vice president to try to preserve that party identity. But this issue of money really split party ranks across the nation. There were pro-silver Republicans who got behind Bryan, a Democrat and populist candidate, while there were pro-gold Democrats called the Gold Bugs, or the National Democrats, who nominated their own candidate. And so McKinley, he relied on his experience, his reputation for honesty and good judgment, the wealth of his party, and just his good record, pretty much. And the Depression worked to his advantage as well. But you have Bryan, the Democrat and populist candidate, who was a great speaker, but he was handicapped by the fact that he was young and relatively inexperienced. So he conducted a vigorous campaign. He traveled over 18,000 miles, delivered over 600 speeches, but on election day, McKinley decisively defeated Bryan. So that brings our discussion of Chapter 20 to a close.